When I ask a question, feel free to jump in. If somebody says something that you want to, bounce off of, please feel free to do that. But, the question is, what does net zero mean to you? How does your organization interpret that phrase? Do you talk about it a lot? And how is the work that you're currently engaged in related to the goal of net zero emissions? And let's actually start with David, since you kind of touched a little bit on that with propellant. Is there anything you'd like to add about net zero and that specific goal?
Sure. I think one thing, and actually probably Elvin is very familiar with this topic. One thing people don't really think about when they think about rocket propellant is they'll look at, well, how many total tons of equivalent carbon dioxide is in a single rocket. But the story is actually much more complicated than that, because it's not just the total amount of carbon dioxide or other pollutants that you're emitting, it's where you're polluting them. So if you're polluting them at ground level, that has one impact. If you're polluting them in the stratosphere, that has a very different impact. I think one of the statistics, right, is black carbon or soot emitted by rocket propellants such as kerosene in the upper atmosphere has a 500 times larger radiative forcing function than it does at sea level. And I haven't heard of anybody taking this sort of increased impact into their emissions. I mean, so far there's not much emissions reporting on rockets in general, but as we move towards, oh, there we go. Sorry, got distracted by the video. But as we move towards reporting scope 3, then I think this is going to be an important aspect of that.
Thank you. Elwin?
I can follow up, yeah. So you asked about net zero initially, and I'll just start by saying net zero is a very real concept, especially on the other side of the Atlantic, because of the EU Green Deal. That's actually a requirement that we have to converge towards. So 2050, the EU should be carbon neutral, and by 2030, we have to cut down 55% of our emissions. And also, I should say net zero, it means that we have to emit less, but we can also compensate. But at the end of the day, we have to emit a whole less. So that's the first thing, and the European Space Agency especially is actually implementing this agenda in a very real way. So we have we can talk about this a bit later. We have working groups every other week. We are trying out some policies that could actually be used by the European Space Agencies to develop some of the future contracts. So there are a number of things that are happening that are directly related to that net zero expectations. And regarding to what you said, David, it's a very good way to get started on the topic. Here we talk about the impact of the overall industry, but one of the key areas where we've not been able to look at that much because we don't know much about it is the emissions in the upper layers of the atmosphere. It's not a very intuitive thing, so that it doesn't help, I would say. But when you emit something like black carbon, as you mentioned, which kerosene, propelled rockets emit a lot of them, what happens is that the residence time in the atmosphere is much longer, especially above 12 kilometers, above the ozone layer altitude. And so their impact is much longer. So it has an impact on climate, which is today's topic, but also on ozone depletion as well, and a few other things. I'll put a link to a paper that kind of sums up all this in the chat. But yeah, that's the kind of counterintuitive aspect to it. It's very unique. There's no other industry on Earth emitting in these layers of the atmosphere, so we have to be careful about it. And yeah, to mention what we do at Ariane Group in that regard, it's throughout the whole life cycle of the launcher. So from the thinking about how it's going to, the concept of preparation, how it's going to operate, is it going to be reusable or not, which is what we're investigating for the future launchers. The kind of propellants, methane LOX is one of the fuels that are actually expected to be reducing the impact from kerosene and from solid propulsion, from hypergolics as well, which is a hydrazine. Some of you may know it better that way. And LOX and H2, so hydrogen, is also one of the fuels that we look at, which I think Stoke Space also uses. So these are the avenues we're looking into. And also, because I mentioned the whole life cycle, we manufacture in Europe and we bring the launcher in French Guiana. So the ship that we're actually using, and that just brought Ariane 6, the first flight model, just the past week in French Guiana, is equipped actually with sails that cut down 30% of the fuel used during the way through the Atlantic. So kind of need to attack on all the aspects of the life cycle. Yeah.
All right, I'll round us out here. I think at a really high level, net zero just means that we are emitting less across all these different pollutants than we are absorbing. That's, equal is net zero. Something that I find a lot in the sustainability community, the terrestrial sustainability community, is they're moving towards this idea of net negative, where they want to take out more than they produce. And I think that makes a lot of sense given that we're already kind of at the tipping point of averting massive changes to the climate. So NASA is looking at this from multiple ways, right? Because in order to do this, you need to, one, understand the emissions, so measuring it. Two, just like Elwin was saying, we want to attack this from multiple points, right? We want to reduce the emissions that are created, and we want to find new ways to gather up more of those emissions safely. So NASA is working on a lot of these. The Institute for Space Studies in New York is part of the IPCC group that's focused on really characterizing the way that upper atmosphere emissions affect the atmosphere, from black carbon, from all kinds of rocket emissions. And then separately, you have things like the sustainable aviation work that NASA does, green propellant work. And I think to a lesser extent, I think some of the really adventurous stuff, right? And I might be getting ahead of us on another question here, but those really big sci-fi efforts are, I think, ways that we can really transform the way that our economy works. As soon as industry exists off of Earth, all of those emissions disappear. As soon as we're mining off of Earth, all of that stops happening. But it forces us to go through this really important hurdle that David was talking about of reducing those emissions from launch, because we can't get rid of the terrestrial ones until we get through that hurdle of creating more emissions to get all of that industry and raw resource extraction off of the Earth.
Can I just add, I think fantastic points by both Ellen and Jordan. I just want to go off of Ellen's point on the entire life cycle. Absolutely agreed that the rocket emissions, we need to use more sustainable propellants. But a large part of the industry's emissions, like we're saying, are from cradle to grave of what happens terrestrially. And so I think as long as we can keep making progress on that front, it's going to be harder to abate, all rocket emissions, right? Unless we do direct carbon capture. I don't know that, as much as I would love space elevators, I don't know that they're in our immediate future. But as long as we can tackle, the majority of the emissions on the ground, and then either use offsets, quality offsets, or direct carbon capture for rocket launches, I think there is a path forward, but it will take innovation on all fronts.
Thanks for rounding that out. One point that Jordan brought up that I think would be interesting to follow up on is, and actually all of you have brought it up in some way, is the idea of information and its importance to net zero, right? And how we may not have a lot of information about what happens when we're emitting at different parts of the atmosphere. So I'd like to throw you all the question, what do you think are the biggest things we have yet to learn about our impact on net zero, our impact on emissions as an industry? What are the biggest open-ended questions that, you personally or your company or organization are interested in figuring out in the next 5 to 10 years?
I'm happy to kick us off with this one. I think just characterizing space sector emissions by mission and by activity is a big push. The Europeans have been making a lot of really good progress on this, in large part to those mandates that Ellen was talking about. But in the US, it's still not a common practice to do environmental impact assessments of every single space mission.
I'll just add on the note of space missions. So we've talked about rocket launches. One thing we haven't talked about much are it's kind of an interesting problem. On the one hand, we have increased congestion in low Earth orbit with the amount of satellites going up there and planned satellites from you know, not just US companies, but international companies as well. And then on the other hand, you know, the current mitigation for that is deorbiting into the atmosphere. And once we start seeing tens of thousands of satellites, constellations that need to be, you know, their whole business plan is to reconstitute them frequently, which means that you're deorbiting them also frequently. And so that impact on the, not just the upper atmosphere, but then how that then impacts, you know, talking about the ozone layer, I think that is very poorly understood, and mitigation strategies for that are also, you know, equally poorly understood.
Yeah. Elvin, can you speak to, I know you have a lot of experience in the commercial industry. Can you speak to, you know, your perspective on this, and also maybe why companies might be incentivized to start environmental impact assessments?
Yeah, so that's actually the word incentivization, I think, is the key here. And then, you know, sometimes the market can do it, and sometimes the regulator has to intervene, and we do that often in Europe. We shouldn't do that too often, but that's one way to do it. I don't think that, you know, strong penalties are the right way to do this, especially in a very fast-growing industry. However, making sure that all the innovation that's happening right now, all the companies being built are picking the right propellants, picking the right technology, so that when it all consolidates, we come back to a number of companies that have, we have actually a world fleet of launch vehicles that have the most sustainable options. As David say, we will always emit, and we'll have to compensate for that, and we'll have also to question also the way we use this access to space, and what kind of missions we conduct. But there will be emissions, and actually maybe one of the most important thing here, and which is what got me into this topic 5 years ago, is that they are really good levers to work on it. Levers that you don't have in aviation or in the automotive industry, because it's already late and the technological inertia is very high. If you switch some propellants, you switch some manufacturing practices, you switch some materials being used, it's not only 1 or 2% like you can, you know, reduce on an airplane when you cut down, you know, 0.5% on an engine consumption. It's a revolution, you know. Here we can cut down 80%, and this is an approximate figure. If you go from kerosene, for instance, to LOX LH2 or methane, with big uncertainty again, but that's the hopeful part of it. There is a lot of things we can do in the space industry right now before it all consolidates to you know, a small number of launchers. Yeah.
I'd actually like to add to that. I see a comment about, can we stop being so techno-futurist? You know, point taken. Want to keep that aware, but there's also a lot of alternatives that are happening right now. You know, spin launch. There's a couple of companies in the US that are working on, you know, non-consumable ways of launching relatively small amounts of mass. And that's, you know, that's techno-presentist.
Yeah,
On that note,
sorry,
on that note,
a very
your responses will feed into it, but you know, broadly, what innovations do you all think in the space industry have the most promise to help achieve net zero? This could be technical, this could be, you know, political systems, this could be a change in culture.
I just want to quickly add, so this actually gets over to that last comment, especially the chat comment. So I would argue methane propellants are not techno-futurist. That's already happening, right? I mean, Relativity attempted a launch, and then the Chinese launched a rocket using methane to orbit. This is not, you know, in the next 20 years. This is today. This is happening. Now, are we going to retire Falcon 9 tomorrow? No. But Starship is going to do what? They said 9 flights this year in payload. I think this is rapidly becoming a reality. I think you know, it's interesting how fast technology is moving. 20 years ago, if you said we're going to land boosters and reuse them, that would have been, you know, people would have said you're crazy. Today, we're looking at, you know, over 100 launches of Falcon 9. And I think that pace is only accelerating. There's concerns, you know, of what those emissions might be, but I think moving towards reusable rockets, moving towards reusable propellants is fantastic, and I think that is the driving innovation that's going to enable things like space-based solar power. So I think it's fantastic what's going on.
Yeah, in terms of innovations, I would say definitely picking the right propellants. Also, additive manufacturing, when used properly, can also cut down the impact because you reduce the raw amount of metal that you use. You have more energy use for the processing part, but if it's done properly, you can cut down the impact. Reusability is a bit tricky because it's a trade-off. So it's going to depend on your architecture. You're going to burn more fuel because you need to come down. You're also going to burn more fuel because you need to bring to orbit this fuel that you will use to come down. So that you have a more robust and bigger rocket, but at the same time you don't consume all the materials that you're going to have in the rocket you already built to launch next time. So it depends on the architecture. So one of these innovations where we always say it's going to cut down the impact of the space industry. To be realistic, it's mainly done for economic purposes and the responsiveness of the production, etc. It can bring some good things for sustainability, but it has to be done properly, and it's not a given. So it should be followed closely. And that looked back to Jordan's comment of we should be doing a life cycle assessments of these rockets a bit everywhere, and everyone should start doing it to assess it.
Yeah, I think kind of connecting all these, I think that policy and government is the biggest thing for the space sector sustainability. Most companies aren't going to do something that costs them money without benefit unless they're somehow forced to. And there's a broad range of things we can do. I mean, I haven't investigated this too deeply, but I dropped in the chat a link to something that connects Techno Future and Techno Past. It's a wooden satellite. The Japanese are getting ready to launch one pretty soon. And then there are some recent indications that in space manufacturing is making pretty great strides. Just recently, a ZBLAN manufacturer on the space station was able to create very large amounts of this composite material that's more expensive and difficult to make on Earth. So in order to really unlock that potential requires a higher degree of government involvement than I think most of our citizens have stomach for. So these other options are our best bet in the near term.
I just that made me think about, we're kind of ignoring the benefits that satellites provide to climate monitoring and mitigation, right? So there's satellites that are being launched to monitor greenhouse gas emissions, methane leaks from pipelines that otherwise would have gone undetected. You can look at that. I mean, I don't know that their business model, if they're using that as offsets, but like literally, these are essential technologies for us to understand our climate, understand our impact on our climate, and mitigate issues. Deforestation is another one that it's very hard to monitor with boots on the ground, but from satellites, it's actually pretty possible.
On that note, I know we've had some discussion about some of the challenges that the space industry might be facing in terms of, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. But, broadly thinking about the planet as a system, there's a number of, really large, barriers facing our global society in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Would any of you like to talk more about how you see the space industry contributing to those broader initiatives through technology, monitoring, or, other types of infrastructure?
I can go quick again. So I think that, the classic kind of NASA pitch that a lot of space technologies developed directly impact Earth is very relevant here. So, looking at there's obviously there's very tough thermal challenges in space, and I'm not claiming that anybody's developed a cooler in space that then is a better heat pump or something like that, but often there's little things like white paints. So we think, on Earth, white paint is white paint. Maybe in your house, you might choose various shades for inside to see what's better and what's worse aesthetically. But in space, scientists really spend years focusing on how much sunlight exactly is reflected by a certain white paint, right? And they're always trying to get more and more reflective white paints. And NASA is particularly interested in this because they want to use nuclear thermal rockets to send astronauts and goods to Mars. And one of their challenges is they need liquid hydrogen storage on those rockets, and liquid hydrogen tends to boil off in space. So they're investing, they have invested significant money in developing very, very reflective white paints. And so, where this might impact Earth, so we have, heat island effects in cities. If we can reflect more sunlight and absorb less with better white paints, this might actually help out with that. And I'm sure there's other examples as well where investment in space technology can then be transferred down to help Earth.
Yeah, I can add to that. I mean, David brought up measurements, and that's the only way that we even have global climate models. Space has been contributing to this for as long as our activities in space have existed, pretty much. And then in terms of exploration, anywhere we go requires us to be perfectly sustainable, or as sustainable as possible. We need to completely reuse water. We need to completely scrub our oxygen. Any type of exploration mission relies on the same technologies that would enable pure sustainability here on Earth. And then I think in more detail, there are tons of those innovations that that have these benefits on Earth. Everything from like water purification, detecting contaminants in water, it goes on and on. Yeah.
Awesome. I'd like to actually circle back to something that you said earlier, Jordan, about how you think it's really important for government to play a role in, encouraging the space industry to grow more sustainable. And I kind of would like to follow up with this discussion on how, as a global society, we can become more sustainable. There's been a number of environmental economists and folks who argue for kind of alignment of different kinds of innovations to become more sustainable, while also figuring out how, doing that can end up being profitable to companies. And I think maybe a small example might be, how SpaceX has reusable rockets, and now they're kind of one of the industry leaders. So I guess a question to all of you would be, do you think that achieving net zero has to come at the cost of profits, or do you think that there are ways for the industry to work towards achieving that net zero and maintain its growth, or, grow in that sustainable way?
I'd be happy to kick this off. I'll keep it short so others can chime in on this. Yes, but yes, in the sense that it may cost short-term reductions in profit, but that's a question of the timescales we're looking at, right? If we're looking on a quarterly or a yearly basis, yeah. But if we're looking at the really long term, like our kids' lifetimes, then no, absolutely, it's the opposite, right? Any damage to our ability to live here profitably is being massively affected by our inability to become more sustainable today.
Yeah, it comes back to a typical tragedy of the commons case, where if everyone acts alone, well, it's not beneficial to them, but at the end of the day, if no one does, it's terrible for everyone. So we do have to act, and I think, naturally, it's the role of the government to accelerate this push. I wouldn't see it that way in terms of that's the cost of a profit. Industry is going to maximize whatever direction they have to go to. It can be profits, but if suddenly environmental performance becomes a competitive advantage, then it's also a source of profit. And because of public opinion and because of customers' opinions on their overall impact, because when you purchase a launch, for instance, from a launch manufacturer, well, the impact of their launch is going to come back on your balance at the end of the day, because you're using the satellite that was launched by this launcher. So I would say I wouldn't see in terms of less or more profits, but in terms of if societies are able to actually push these right regulations, to push the innovation in the right direction, because it's pretty clear that in the 2030s, 40s, 50s, and we saw that with automotive, we saw that with aviation, it will be a competitive advantage, that's for sure. And because of the huge technological inertia we have in this industry, if we don't, incentivize in those directions right now, is going to take a lot of time to come back. So I think it's beneficial in the long term, even for profits. And I would say, Europe is supposed this year to come out with a space law, and there should be also some Earth sustainability aspect, not just space sustainability. So we'll see which direction we're taking on this side of the Atlantic, but hopefully there's going to be a bit of at least publicizing or sharing the impact, or nothing too strong, because it's a very competitive business, and we shouldn't harm the interior EU industry. But by going through publicizing and sharing, that's a good way to just use public opinion to do its job, I think.
I'll just add too, I think for the most part, I definitely agree with Jordan in that there's going to be a lot of, early costs for later advantage. I think there are a few examples where we can see profits now by being more sustainable. So one of them, again, is Earth monitoring satellites, right? Their whole business model is to help us get to net zero and be profitable. So I think that's a good one. And then from, Stoke's example, I think having rapidly reusable, fully reusable rockets not only is more sustainable, but it is more cost effective and should drive up profits while bringing down costs. And I think that is, I think honestly, I hate to say it, but that is probably more core to our ethos. And then the sustainability side is awesome, and we're fully supportive of that. But it just happens to be that they kind of, marry together in that way. Similarly, moving from kerosene to methane, it turns out methane-based rockets are high performance, such that you can actually tune down the pressures and temperatures so that they are more reusable, right? So you get that synergy there as well. On the flip side, there are some avenues where I don't see how we don't drive up costs while being sustainable. So, for example, we're talking about again deorbiting satellites into the atmosphere. If we want to stop doing that and stop polluting the upper atmosphere, and doing things like bringing them back down to Earth, or putting them into aggregating them into like junkyard orbits and that sort of thing, that does drive up costs, right? And I don't see a way that's immediately profitable. I would love to have like reusable satellites, but right now satellites aren't designed that way, and so there's going to be a hit to anybody's bottom line before they can dispose of them differently than we do today.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing those perspectives. One thing that all of you keep touching on is the idea of policy and regulation. So I'd love to get a little more specific and ask, first, what kind of policy or regulatory bodies or entities you think are most relevant to this? So is there an agency that you think should be playing a really important role? Is there an international organization that needs to be playing this role? And then second, what do you think the timeline looks like? Are we still in a stage where we're gathering a lot of information and need to keep doing that? Or are we at a stage where we're able to take some distinct policy actions?
I start by mentioning that there is a really good report that you should have a look at, which is from the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. They wrote something about the impact of mega constellations, of deploying those mega constellations. There is the debris aspect, of course, but there is maybe 20% of the report about the atmospheric impact it could have. And they make a lot of policy recommendations, which I don't all have in mind, so you should have a look at these. But it's quite an interesting report, and they really did the analysis in depth. On my end, to answer to your question, I think the main actor should be political. I think it should be governments acting on this, and the implementation should be done by the space community through the agencies. They have a lot of leverage through all the contracts, all the institutional contracts, and I think that's the way it should be done. Because if you start regulating things from too much of the outside, you end up hurting the industry. But at the same time, you can't ask the space industry itself to make those sacrifices. So it has to be a societal decision to act on the space industry that way, and then for space industry to organize around those new directions. Yeah, hopefully in the next few years we'll have a very practical answers to this. We'll see.
Oh, after you, David.
Go ahead.
All right. I think a lot of organizations would be really critical to making this happen, right? I mean, ultimately, we want all of them. But if I had to pick some, in the US, it's going to be Congress. It's going to be regulatory bodies that are responding to the demands from Congress. NASA can try, and it has been trying to push different kinds of best practices, and that's really important. That's great, and a lot of the times industry can move without legislation, and that happens a lot here. But for it to become global, UN USA, um, the UN generally, and the ITU. I don't see them becoming really prescriptive because they're, um, you know, participation by consensus. Um, but it does also raise a common question in sustainability of countries that are just starting their space programs and just starting to build up. It feels unfair that the countries that have had access to space for all these years are going to now force them to comply with things that they may not have quite the same capacity to do yet. So I think there's something about equity that needs to come into that through these international organizations, while our national and continent like European organizations focus on moving our industries to where we'd like them to be.
I think it's a very good point. I was just going to point out too that I think to bring back something we mentioned early on, that a lot of our emissions as an industry, are terrestrial. And so I think we can focus on what we do in the, not terrestrial segment, but I think we can join the rest of other sectors in how they look at abating their emissions from their terrestrial emissions. And that goes a long way to our total impact. And I think that alleviates some of the concerns of stifling innovation, or I hadn't thought about equity. I think that's a great one as well. If we focus on space itself, then there's maybe concerns there. But if we look at more broadly, how do we join the global community in other sectors and how we abate emissions? And then for the non-terrestrial portion of it, the atmospheric and space-based emissions, probably more atmospheric, I think what would go a long way, as we said, there aren't going to be ways to completely get to net zero. So we have to rely on either direct air capture or carbon offsets. If there's a role for the government that I think in the near term would play a huge boon, is if they can help either measurement-based or science-based methods of qualifying offsets. I think right now there's a large concern that many offsets are pretty poor, to be honest, and they don't actually show what they think they're showing. And so if there's a way to make those better, then the space industry can use those to abate their activities that are hard or impossible to abate, then that is a route forward. And I think that is a role for government to play.
A lot to chew on there. But I think relevant to that point that you just brought up, one thing that I think we've learned from other industries and other corporations, as we try to figure out how to, facilitate, corporate accountability, is how do you hold a company accountable for generating impact assessments that are realistic, that don't, greenwash or fudge the numbers? How do we establish information sharing systems so that so that we have an accountability system to test those products and things against once we have more of them?
So I can step in on that one. That's actually, I think, what ESA is trying to do these days. I think that was back in 2012 that the first life cycle assessment was done, space systems, and then Actually, I think Ariane 5 was the first launcher to have a life cycle assessment being done on it. And ESA, the European Space Agency, has been the one pushing for this. And because of this, it's now in the DNA of Ariane Group and other European launch manufacturers. And they continue doing this work. There was the, I have to remember the name. There was a statement for responsible space sector. It was signed about a year and a half ago in Europe by a number of space companies. And from that followed on a number of working groups with academia, with industry. There's also some groups just involved on environmental aspect, not necessarily to the space industry, but that bring expertise to the groups. And they build on all the LCA methodology that has been developed in other industries, because of course they have been attacking the topic for longer. So we should leverage all this experience, especially from the chemicals industry, from automotive, from aviation. And we just add the space bricks to that. So of course the emissions in the upper atmosphere, but also some materials and something that we are the ones using and no one else has to use it because of temperatures and pressure, etc. So there is these working groups, and I think at the end of the day, the idea is to have these methodologies being published, being shared with everyone, probably not just in Europe, but beyond, so that we can all have this ability to measure and to build this level playing field in terms of sustainability assessment.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I find it hard to imagine a world without some kind of enforcement mechanism to do that. In the US, most products and companies are allowed to do their own assessments, and that varies wildly. In France, they have this BEP. It's this repository of all these different products and services that all have to go through a pretty similar process of assessing the life cycle impacts of the product's manufacturing, operation, disposal. Having that ability to do an apples to apples comparison, it requires that. It requires this, large community engagement of developing the standards by which we would do these assessments broadly across the industry.
Yeah, both great comments, and hopefully, afterwards, maybe we can come up with a list of some of those resources that you've been sharing in the chat, because I know that I'm curious to read some of them, and I'm sure many of our audience members are as well. And actually, speaking of our audience, we have a question that I'd love to field about how can we get the space industry to consider and address the environmental impact of data servers. A lot of our conversation about sustainability does connect to all the data that we're collecting and companies are selling from space. So do you all have any kind of pulse on what the conversation about these data servers emissions happens to be? Is there conversation on it yet?
I don't want to keep jumping in, but have y'all engaged on this at all?
So not terribly. I will say that I do know of interest of, data servers in space, and I think I saw recently data servers on the moon even. I think it's fascinating, and there's definitely interesting applications, especially for things like edge compute, where you want to do compute in space before you then pass down data. So you're reducing how much bottleneck there is on that transmission layer. I think in terms of moving the bulk of data centers into space, it's an interesting concept. Obviously, there's lots of space-based, solar power is abundant in space, and cooling is much easier in space. I think the challenge becomes the sheer mass involved with data centers. I think there's not a lot of public perception of how much real estate and how much warehouses of data centers exist out there. And I don't have a metric on hand of, how many even super heavy launches that would be, but it's pretty astronomical, I think.
It's an interesting avenue, and I know definitely some people on the European side are doing the computations and trying to see if it works out. Some companies are working on this. But the thing is, yeah, as you said, you need to deploy the whole infrastructure and not just the servers. You need also the power infrastructure and all the square kilometers of solar panels to power it. But of course, the cooling is easier, and we know that down on Earth, it's what necessitates the most energy. So it's a trade-off. I think it comes down to the mathematics at some point. If it makes sense, why not? But a good rule of thumb is that when there is this kind of scale-up infrastructures, it's hard to make it neutral. So yeah, let's make sure it makes sense, and also that we use it for the right reasons. At some point, one way to reduce this impact is also to have more efficient computations and to use it for good purposes. So that's also one way to cut down the impacts.
Yeah, I do a quick echo there. I think in a lot of these areas, you'll find that anything that is predominantly outside of the space sector is usually kind of left to them to resolve. There is a lot of work, like everyone highlighted, that folks who manage data centers are working on better ways to cool the servers, to make the storage and retrieval of information more efficient. In space operations, with the advent of these mega constellations, high resolution imaging, high resolution video from exploration missions, that's something that NASA has been working on. We've also had to develop ways to better compress and transmit that information, just like was brought up. I do worry that the rate of demand is going to exceed the ability for us to mitigate that, though.
On that note, thinking about the different variables that we're weighing and trying to make these predictions, how hopeful are you guys that the space sector can eventually achieve net zero with existing and technologies that are actively in the near future, not just speculation?
I mean, we have to, ultimately we have to reduce the emissions, and that's a lot to say when you consider that we had less than 100 launches in the 2000, we had more than 200 the past year. We have to reduce the emissions, and we have to do some compensation at some point. If we keep using space the way we're doing it right now, and even increase this activity, there is no way this is a net zero activity by itself. It's just I think there was a comment just before about being realistic about the. I think it's important to to just own this impact and have a healthy communication about it. If we keep using it that way, it will naturally be net zero. So we have to find solutions beyond just reducing the emissions, improving the environmental performance of the launchers, to compensate and to change also the way we use space. Some missions are essential, critical, matters of sovereignty. Some are not. And that's also one of the questions that should be asked. But I don't think this one comes to the industry. I don't think the industry should have to say, we won't be covering that kind of space missions because it's not they can, but they don't have to. Governments have to. That's their role in here, to say, we should prioritize that kind of missions, and those are not environmentally performant enough to be managed.
I think it'll get worse before it gets better, but I'm hopeful that it will eventually get better in terms of net zero.
Yeah, I definitely second both of those comments. I think it's going to be a challenging road ahead, and some things will inevitably be very difficult to abate, but I think we'll get there.
This is all recorded anyway, so we'll be back in 20 years and see about that. Realists, right?
All right, I guess we're freestyling for the rest of this.
Oh, here, let's see if I can jump back on. One moment. Hello, hi everybody. Well, it seems like Carrie dropped off for just a minute, but I will I think we're nearing the end, so I'll jump in with kind of one last kind of concluding question for all of you, which is a couple things. So we just kind of talked about how hopeful we are and kind of what technologies are coming in the near future. So for our audience, which includes lots of people who are interested and excited about this topic, do you have any suggestions for resources or strategies for getting involved and helping this along for the audience?
I can get started on that one. I shared a link just before from a paper from 2022 where we kind of summarize what we know and what we don't know about the impact of launchers and some policy recommendations. And if you look into there, you can also find some interesting areas to pursue research on or to launch startups. That would have a better sustainability performance. So this is one resource. I mentioned the GAO reports. It's really a great report. I would recommend you looking at it. So Government Accountability Office, deployment of mega constellations, that'd be the one. And in terms of organization, I think, JEC is kind of having conversation on this topic. So that's one platform. In Europe, and they are publishing about it, ESA is very active. They have a clean space office in the Netherlands that is very active. And they also have a sustainability team that is launching more and more stuff, and they are publishing some reports. Ariane Group, actually, we are also, thanks Jordan. We're also publishing some figures on that and showing a way to try to do it for the next launchers that we're developing, and that includes developing the methodologies themselves because they just don't exist for some aspects of the life cycles.
I'll make the cheesy emotional plug here. It's us, it's this community, it's reaching out to each other. We've all got a different piece of this pie from our past experience, and we probably all know other people that are more experienced than us. So I would highly encourage to just directly reach out to people.
That's great. I think also I would love to know as well how to keep track. So if anybody has any ideas, definitely I can keep communicating. And it's fascinating how fast our industry is growing and the clean tech industry is growing. And I think it is very challenging to keep track of what everything is happening and what people are doing. And but it's what a fantastic time to be part of the industry.
Great. Yeah, thank you all. And we have Carrie back. So Carrie, did you have any last comments or questions you wanted to ask before we wrap up?
Yeah, sorry, my Wi-Fi at work decided to pick today to drop off. But I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing all of your perspectives and for showing that there are people in this industry that do really care about our climate and that care about how space fits into our overall societal ecosystem. So, thanks again, and looking forward to reading a lot of the resources that all of you sent over.
Yeah, thank all of you so much. This was a really fantastic conversation. And yeah, for anyone in the audience who's interested in these things, these are people you can reach out to. And also, of course, feel free to reach out to our group because this is the topic that we have a lot of passion about, and we're hoping to start writing about and speaking about some more. So, yeah.